there are often these claims made about this high growth rate during the UPA rule, the 2004 to 2014. With itself, of course, to me, I mean, I for a long time argued actually that growth was actually built on the back of the reforms that Narsimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee had already put in place. Because if I look at the list of reforms by the UPA, it's a very thin list. They didn't do very much. To its credit, I would say that it did not do anything that would have been terribly harmful to the economy. There was no, you can also do. I mean, Indira Gandhi, for example, adopted many bad policies, which you'll call the anti-growth policies. UPA too, actually, a whole lot of anti-growth things happened. All the policies were being done by the National Advisory Council, which was headed by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. Prime Minister was practically, powerless in this whole process. Basically, the show was being run by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. So I personally think that UPA 2 was a fairly damaging period for future growth. To my mind, actually, the big change really has been the effectiveness of the government's infrastructure expenditure. I mean, the manner in which it is being actually translated into roads, bridges, buildings. We have seen as the Mandapam where the G20 was held very recently, the Dwarika project that is underway. Even if you look at the airports that are being revamped, so many more cities have been actually connected by air now. Go to railways, the fantastic Vande Bharat trains. So, all around, the infrastructure development has been incredibly impressive. I mean, I say one of the things about Prime Minister Modi really is that he really does think big. Political language has also changed. Prime Minister says, I'm doing reforms by conviction, not by compulsion. Prime Minister really built this, digital infrastructure based on Aadhaar, mobile telephony and all, and used that extremely effectively. He also has been largely successful in eliminating any corruption that used to exist. And he has deployed very, very effectively the digital technology. And that has allowed actually him to deliver the benefits practically close to 100%. This Prime Minister believes in very, very multidimensional development. I think he's not, one reform or two reform or five reform. It's not like that, at all. He really is very multidimensional.
Welcome to the 11th episode of NIJ Podcast with Ananya. Today we have the immense pleasure of introducing our distinguished guest, a luminary in the world of economics, Mr. Arvind Panagariya. A recipient of the prestigious Padma Bhushan Award, Mr. Panagariya has had an illustrious career spanning various pivotal roles. He has served as the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, has been India's G20 Sherpa, and has also been the Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank. Currently, Mr. Panagariya is a Professor of Economics and holds the esteemed Jagdish Bhagwati Professorship of Indian Political Economy at the reputed Columbia University in the United States. His dedication to education and leadership extends to his role as the Chancellor of Nalanda University in Bihar. Join us today for this special episode as we aim to discover India's growth story.
So thank you so much, Mr. Arvind Panagariya, for joining us today directly from New York. And a very good morning to you, sir. And really, it's humbling to have you make time to join us for an NIJ podcast with Ananya today.
My pleasure, Ananya. Really great to be with you this morning and your evening.
Yes. All right. So let's get started with the first question, sir. Anybody who will look up Indian economy and is looking up any data around Indian economy, they typically want to know about their GDP figures or their growth figures. And as I was looking up, we have the latest Q1 data showing that India is almost clocking 7 to 8% of GDP growth in Q1. And then, of course, there are a lot of controversies around whether this is accurate representation of the data or not. But what's your direct answer to how well is India doing as of now on its GDP?
Go back to the pandemic. So there had been a sharp decline in the growth rate in the particular quarter in which we had this very severe lockdown. That was the April, June, July of 2020. And that decline during that quarter was so sharp that year our GDP growth rate ended up declining, which is practically unprecedented in recent history, by close to something like, either, if I recall correctly, it was 5.8% negative or maybe 6%. I mean, somewhere a little below 6. So there was a very big dip. Since then, the economy really came back up very quickly. So what I call, or economists call the V-shaped recovery. So, meaning that you sharply go down and you then come back up. So that it forms a V. So it's a V-shaped recovery, and that happened. And since then, the growth rate has been reasonably high, which is not terribly surprising, because when there is an actual decline in the GDP growth rate in an economy which had been previously growing about close to 7%, if not fully 7%, if you take 5-6 years average in the preceding years. So it's coming back to its original trajectory. So 7.8% in this particular quarter actually is completely plausible. Anything less would have actually been a huge disappointment to me personally, because remember that this quarter we are talking about, which is the first quarter of the fiscal year 23-24. So that's again the April, May, June quarter. And this April, May, June quarter is still on the way to recovery in terms of the trajectory itself. From that, what was something like nearly quarter, something like more than 20% decline in the GDP in that quarter in 2020. So the base had
the same period.
So the base in that quarter has been a bit on the low side. So if you actually look at the quarterly growth rate in 21, 22, and now we are in 23, in this particular quarter, the growth rate has been super high. And if anything, in this particular quarter, even 7.8% this year is lower than what it was in 2022, which was lower than what it was in 2021. Because the recovery is still, the decline in the same quarter in 2020 was so sharp because of the very strict lockdown that India had implemented, that we are still recovering from that. Now, allow me just half minute. I want to comment on what you said about, all these naysayers who doubt the data and all. I think that in our country has been a very unfortunate development, that this kind of doubt has been planted in the GDP data. To the point that, sometimes the doubt has been planted almost to the point that, somehow the government is trying to fudge the data. Now, I worked in the government, for 3 years roughly. We don't do that. That has never been the case in the government of India. I imagine nor in the states, but certainly government of India, I can testify to it, that that is not our system. There is a firewall between the ministry that puts together the data and anybody else. Nobody finds out actually what the GDP growth rate is going to be, except a couple of hours at the most prior to the press conference, and a couple of hours prior, we are told. I mean, I used to find out similarly when the day they were going to hold MOSFI was going to hold the press conference, principally because we then had to be prepared to answer the media. So that couple of hours you used to think how you're going to put out your response to the media. So that is all. So this sort of thing, and another way to put it. Now that's the sort of what I know from being inside the government, but also just think of the logic of this. That these allegations started somewhere in 2017 or so, about going back to 2015, etc. Now, that is, GDP growth rate is being actually exaggerated by the government by 2 percentage points every year. Now, think about it. Think about it, that if my GDP is 100 and it rises to 105 the following year, then to raise the growth rate, so my growth rate, let's say, is 5%, and I want to then overstate it by 2 percentage points. So from 100, instead of 105, I would declare my GDP to be 107. Not this 107 is going to be the base over which my growth will have to be measured the next year.
Right. Yep.
And now if I want to raise it by another 2 percentage points, I have to, the 5% growth, I will have to now add 4 percentage points to the GDP to exaggerate by another 2%. Very soon, as the first year, you are exaggerating it by 2 percentage points, the next 4 percentage points, next 6 percentage points. Very quickly, it diverges.
Right.
You will be very quickly discovered, because ultimately you can also look at some of the other indicators, that are the other indicators moving as fast as, or are the other indicators also as high as
Whether
your
they follow
GDP.
a similar trajectory.
So, this fudging game is not so easy. I mean, you can fudge the GDP in any given year, but how do you fudge the growth rate over a longer period of time? You cannot do it.
Right.
It's a losing game for any government, which wants to be credible to the people. So I think that's really, I've taken this time to explain, because this is really a very unfortunate thing, that this kind of doubt gets continuously planted in the minds of the people.
No, thank you so much. I think, and it's very, very relevant. I mean, as we record this podcast, this question on the legitimacy of GDP figures, I mean, this skepticism, I mean, it's so important for credible voices like yours to really, I would say, almost bust such myths, for not just for students of economics, but also for common Indians who...
Right. No, because, people gauge the performance of the government. GDP is an important gauge.
Yes.
So you can see, this is why this also gains a little more credibility, because people think that, this is one of the, basically this is the barometer of the overall economic health. And so therefore the government, to show that it is very healthy, will want to fudge it, right? So therefore that gains more credibility, unfortunately, But this has never been the tradition, you see, because if you start fudging the data, you can do it 1 or 2 times, but then very quickly it is the boy who cried wolf. Your credibility lost forever.
True. You spoke about COVID and COVID as an external shock to the Indian economy. My question to you is, now retrospectively, it's almost been more than 2 to 3 years, and we are looking at, when you spoke about how the economy is jumping back, would it be right to say that the Indian economy, the way it was managed by the current government, did demonstrate resilience of some sorts? Or if I were to frame it again, do you think the current government's economic management of the pandemic was sort of in place and in alignment with the economic principles, and do you think they fared well?
My credentials on that one could be suspect, because the government actually did what I was advocating at the time. which was contrary to everybody else. You can go back and look at the records. Nobody, at least from outside. There may be people, obviously there had to be people inside to have been following exactly what I had been advocating. There had to be inside advocates of that approach as well. But from the outside, I was the only one, probably, in fact, I was the only one anywhere in the world making that argument, which is the following, that, everywhere else in the United States, Europe, etc., the governments really went to town with these very massive cash transfers. Because the view they took was that somehow demand had collapsed because of COVID. And therefore, to keep the demand strong, print money and give it to people. And there were tons of economists in our own country as well making that demand. I mean, the government was practically under siege. And you can go back to my writings during that period. And so it's all on the record. It's not like, I'm saying that I was telling my friends or my family or my wife. That was not the case. It's written, it's all there. And the argument that I had was that, look, this pandemic basically is shocking both demand and supply, because it's not simply that people have been confined to their houses and flats and so forth, and therefore they can't really go out to shop or somehow they are afraid, or whatever the fear is which has caused them to hold on to their spending. But it is also a supply shock, because as workers, we are not able to go to the workplace. Restaurants cannot open, because the staff of the restaurant cannot be there. Factory cannot be open because workers cannot be there. So the supply has also been shocked. So even if you stimulate demand, how in the world will you stimulate supply? See, when there is a problem of deficiency in demand only, you got excess capacity in production, and because there is not enough demand, therefore they are not using that excess capacity, then stimulating demand can be helpful. But if the factories themselves have chosen to stay closed, banks have chosen to stay closed on account of the threat from the pandemic, you can give everybody whatever money you want to print. But I mean, it's not only, it's not merely, in fact, the factory being closed, but even when I got money in my pocket, how am I going to go and spend it?
Right.
Because there is pandemic, I can't go out. Right? If there's anything that's contact intensive, it is a problem. Yep. So that is so what happened in the US and Europe also was that people who received the money collected it into the banks. So the savings, by the end of it, the savings had gone up in the United States, extra savings over what they normally are, all the households, by more than $2 trillion. And then when they started spending that money, of course, that led to inflation. US, since the pandemic, the opening up happened fully, the inflation has been unprecedented, for the first time in 40 years. Meaning, I remember I came to the US in 1974, so I remember the late 70s and early 1980s inflation, which was very high. And since then, the inflation rate in the US has been 2%, but then it came to hit almost 10%. And that's because a lot of the money that was sitting in the accounts that the government had given was being spent.
Right.
India, on the other hand, smartly, and which is exactly what I said, look, what you want to do is make sure that people have the food and they have the shelter. And so the government very wisely went in and increased the expenditure, increased the free distribution of food to something close to 2/3 of the households in India, practically 80% of the households in rural areas, by 5 kilograms per person per month, and that took care of the needs of the people because in any case, more money if you had given, they would not have gone out to spend because the pandemic was a threat to going out in the first place.
Right.
Um, so we did not get that kind of inflation in India.
Yes.
And the recovery in growth was then also relatively rapid, and we are continuing to grow. And by my calculation, we are back to the pre-pandemic growth rate of about 7%. Now, the GDP level itself is still not where it would have been had there been no pandemic.
Right.
Because of the large decline that happened. So the growth rate is certainly quite is back to where it was pre-pandemic. It has been there now for almost 2 years, more than 2 years, roughly. So growth rate is back to where it needs to be, quite, in fact, a little bit higher because it's still trying to recover over the decline that happened in the year 2020. But the GDP still, I think, is if you look at the trend GDP where it would have been had there been no pandemic, then we're probably still a little bit lower. But I see fantastic prospects. We can talk about that.
Yeah. So 2 questions on that. You spoke about supply side investment by the government. So we'll take a question on infrastructure because a lot of us know that despite the lockdown, despite the pandemic, government continued to invest in infrastructure. I mean, any Aam Aadmi aurat knows that while the schools and while everything was shut down, government was around the clock investing in infrastructure. So what are your quick thoughts on probably the magnitude and scale of investments in infrastructure, and how do you see that sort of paving the way for a very strong foundation of the Indian economy?
No, it's a very good question. It's a very good question, actually. And the government did actually, as the recovery began, as the economy began to open up, the government did ramp up the infrastructure spending. That was a very wise thing to do. And not only this was not all merely because of the increased expenditure. That was not it. Actually, what the government has been also trying to do is to change the composition of expenditure itself, its own expenditure, moving from a lower share, reducing the share of the current expenditures and towards capital expenditure, and capital expenditure is what infrastructure spending is. So that has been a very healthy development. So that's about the expenditure. But what also needs to be recognized is the quality of expenditure, how that expenditure is translated into infrastructure assets. To my mind, actually, the big change really has been the effectiveness of the government's infrastructure expenditure. I mean, the manner in which it is being actually translated into roads, bridges, buildings. We have seen as the Mandapam where the G20 was held very recently, the Dwarika project that is underway. Even if you look at the airports that are being revamped, so many more cities have been actually connected by air now. Go to railways, the fantastic Vande Bharat trains. I'm saying fantastic because I've seen the pictures, but one of these visits when I come back, to travel in one of the Vande Bharat trains. So, all around the infrastructure development has been incredibly impressive. And we are taking on to really large, big projects. I say one of the things about Prime Minister Modi really is that he really does think big. And thinks that, when I visited China, even for example, when I was India's G20 Sherpa at that time when China had the presidency, this was in 2016. And even the venue that I saw there, I was deeply impressed. I said, goodness, we really can't build something like this. But again, going by the pictures that I have seen of Mandapam, including the hall in which the actual summit took place, I think we really outdid China. I mean, so that to me, that's the ultimate thing. If we can really build on that scale. I mean, I'd sort of thought that when I saw some of these very mega projects in China, in the various cities, because Sherpa meetings, there used to be 4 a year. And so they took us to 4 different cities and all. And so you got to see the magnitude and scale of some of those Chinese projects. And it was very impressive, breathtaking. Also, the fast trains that I traveled on in China, all of that quite impressive, actually. But all of that we are not doing. So this is why I also feel very optimistic, that going in the next decade or so, it's going to be big transformation.
Right. You spoke about China. Taking a short question on how big is the Indian economy and what is the global ranking of Indian economy vis-a-vis major economies? You spoke about nearly 7% GDP growth rate, and you say that that's probably, it would have been more had it not been for the pandemic shock. So in the future trajectory, what does the current trajectory show? What does the future trajectory show in terms of, like, if it were a class rule, then how well is India doing as far as its economy is concerned?
Yeah. Okay. So on GDP terms, so we are right now 5th largest economy. So we left UK behind. So good symbolism there, given that that was our colonizing power one time. But more than that, I think, we are going much more rapidly than most other countries. There are some countries which actually are suffering so badly that the GDP is actually declining. So how does it look? Now, mark my word, we'll see if this comes true. Your podcast will be the first one on which anybody said this before. I think we'll become the 3rd largest in 2026. By the end of 2026, which is our fiscal year being 26-27, because our fiscal year runs from April 1 to March 31. So March 31, 2027, which is really more or less the end of 2026, will be the 3rd largest. Most people are saying, by the end of 2030.
Yes,
I'm on my limb. Yeah, so I'm on my limb here. I'm on my limb here saying that this will happen in 2026.
Wow.
People are underestimating. They're not looking at the actual numbers and data and what is going on in the economies that we need to cross. The 2 economies we need to cross is first going to be Germany and then Japan.
Right.
We will get to the 3rd largest 2026. Now, after that, more or less our race will be with the United States. Because I think even though China is right now 2nd in terms of catching up, but China will catch up with the United States before we catch up with China.
Right, because the gap is bigger.
Because the gap between the United States and China is much less than the current gap between us and China.
Right.
So what will happen, my own prediction, this is, you will live to see that, I will not. But my prediction is that India at 125, which will be 2072, will become the 2nd largest. China would be the largest at the time. Now, this is all, of course, contingent on things like peace prevailing, this,
global security, geopolitics.
Global security, geopolitics, all of this remaining what it is currently, So otherwise, of course, anything can happen over such a long period of time. Normally, I've never dared look at that sort of a long run. But just for fun, I've tried to play with the numbers, and this is sort of my, understanding of the trends if they were to continue.
That sounds very promising. Now, coming from 10,000 feet above the sea level, coming back to an Indian household. From the lens of an economist, how do you think an Indian household has changed in terms of basic amenities, say, in the last 10 years?
Yeah. No, I think their change is happening significantly. Although I must say that this change should have been faster. Part of the problem, is in the history of the country, in the economic history of the country. But what good changes have happened? I would say clearly our social safety nets are at a much higher level today. About cash transfers get made about 6,000 rupees per household. It's a modest sum, but in rural areas, 6,000 rupees do go to some distance. Then our food public distribution system, especially in the last 3 years, each household basically is getting about 10 kg per person per month, because 5 kg was already coming under Food Security Act. There is some small nominal charge on that 5 kg, which is about 3 rupees for rice, 3 rupees per kg for rice, and 2 rupees per kg for wheat. But practically most of it is subsidies. So 10 kg is being given since the pandemic, but although 5 kg out of that will ultimately somewhere be discontinued because that was really done in view of the pandemic. So the food-wise, I think households are pretty much secure, and anybody who is poor, and at the very low level, that under the Antodaya scheme, we actually give so there's maybe, I don't know how many, maybe 20 million households, not, I think probably fewer, but anyway, there's some at the very bottom, what we the poorest of the poor households, they already receive, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 25 kg per month per household. Something of that order. So some, they're highly subsidized or more or less free distribution of food is significantly larger than 5 kg, even when there is no pandemic. All right, so that happened. Now, water is being, and to a much larger number of households, water has been brought to the people. The piped water, I'm referring to piped water. This is ongoing program right now. It's not concluded yet. Nal se Jal. So that is being brought in. Most households have been given houses in rural areas. So anybody who could not afford house has been given a large subsidy, and these government's program of building the houses for the poor, particularly in the rural areas, has been incredibly successful. Also, the gas, at least the stove plus the cylinder has been given free of charge by the government, and the first cylinder gas also has been given, and then households are expected to buy their own gas cylinder for the current expenditure. So that also. In addition, of course, if we look at the per capita incomes of the households, they have been rising as well. So, as the economy is growing, the wages, by the way, they also, the other program, important one, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme Act program, the NREGA. The scope of NREGA has been expanded quite a bit as well. So that is another source of income, particularly in the lean season when
Agriculture
right,
production
that's right, when the demand by the farmers on the field is not sufficiently large, then NREGA kicks in, and so the employment for 100 days per person per household is available as well. Right. So I think in terms of ensuring the basic needs of the households, we are pretty much there now. particularly once we also include the income that the households themselves generate. It's not as, in India, because of the poverty, every household is working. The unemployment rates in rural areas is not high at all. It's very low, 3% around, or maybe 4% at the most. But unemployment is not whatever they are doing is not a very high productivity employment, but they are employed and doing something. So that is where we are. But now when I said, just I'll take another half minute. When I said that, we are not doing as well as we should have been. And that, I think, is coming from the fact that the creation of jobs in industry and services in India has been extremely slow. Usually when the economies transform and when the economies grow rapidly, you see this massive kind of, migration of the workers out of agriculture into industry and services.
Right.
That is how the real transformation takes place. Because it has a double whammy. Because first of all, generally labor productivity, output per worker, is significantly higher in industry and services. So when these workers move to the industry and services, they are earning significantly higher incomes. In addition, what happens is that as these workers move out of agriculture, the pressure on land in agriculture declines. So land per worker in agriculture becomes larger.
Increases
as that process happens. In our country, that process has worked incredibly badly. And this is the 76 years history. Of course, it's not the history of today. But that is one jinx that we have not been able to break in any significant way. Even after the reforms started in 91, earlier we could say that policies were socialist policies. They were more or less keeping the people on the land and all. But that part of socialism still has not left us. I think, we just don't think in these terms that ultimate prosperity to the people is going to come from a vast proportion of these workers finding good, higher productivity jobs in industry and services. And largely, what has to work in this process is faster growth of manufacturing. If you look at fast-growing economies of, let's say, South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and China afterwards in 80s, 90s, and 2000 and 2010s, this process really works with the labor-intensive manufacturing growing at close to something like 13 to 15% a year. Our manufacturing has not grown more than 6% or 8% a year. It barely keeps up with the GDP growth rate. It's not leading the GDP growth.
Right.
Whereas in all these successful countries which have transformed over a period of about 3 decades or so, manufacturing has led the growth. Manufacturing itself grows at 12 to 13%, with 13 to 15% a year. And at that rate, it pulls in the workers out of agriculture into industry. So the agricultural productivity also rises because a lot more land per worker, and industry and incomes of the people who migrate also are significantly higher than what they would have been in agriculture.
Right.
And this, unfortunately, is something, we have not appreciated enough. Just to give, numbers on this, this is our workforce composition currently. Our workforce composition is 45% of the workforce is in agriculture. Then another 40% is working in these mom and pop kind of enterprises, which have less than 10 workers each. So a lot of it is, simple shops that they are running either in rural areas or urban areas, or household enterprises that they are running and all, because productivity, even in these industry and services enterprises which are less than 10 workers, it's not a high productivity employment. So 85% of the workforce is there. 45 agriculture, 40 in these tiny enterprises, and the remaining, so less than 10% work, or about 10% work in enterprises which are 20 or more workers. But even 20 workers is not a large enterprise, So if you look at really large enterprises, the Chinese style enterprises, at least 200 workers or more, those are employing less than 6-7%.
Right.
And so our growth process in terms of growth rate is doing fine. But the process itself is less than inclusive, growth process. Inclusion we are trying to do through transfers, through expenditures transfers, but income increases of the households themselves is a bit slower, bit lower. But if manufacturing grows as 13 to 15%, it works like a magnet. Example, last point I should make in this intervention, which is that South Korea, you look at, South Korea in 1960, about 70% of the workforce is in agriculture. By 1990, 30 years later, less than 20%. It falls below 20%. Now, that means that, you had 50 percentage point of the agricultural workforce moving into industry and services within, that span of about 30 years. Right. Korea becomes from rural to urban completely, because remember, all these good things go with it. All the other good things go with it. Your urbanization happens, own incomes rise, so their purchasing power rises and all. And South Korea eliminated the kind of this extreme poverty that we are still have some bit of it left at the bottom, without any social spending. I mean, there was no cash transfer being done, no public distribution systems being run, nothing. But the people's incomes themselves rose so rapidly that
distributed.
That basically the market generated them enough income to eliminate poverty.
Right.
And that's the same story in Taiwan. You get in Singapore, even China. If you look at it, they after they started growing 10% or so, it's not like they in a big way went after social programs, social spending programs. If anything, for them, it was going in some sense the other way around, because workers who moved from their villages to the cities, they lost whatever their benefits in their villages existed at the time, right? In the Chinese system, your benefits were tied to where you lived,
right?
And so they lost those. But even then, they moved because the attraction of significantly higher income in the urban areas in manufacturing was significantly more.
Right.
So that I think is the work we still need to do.
You spoke about social spending. In the Indian context, do you think the current government has tried to draw a line between freebie culture, subsidy culture, and sort of moved more towards investment in household level amenities? Do you see a change in the nature of social spending that might have happened in the last 10 years?
So the way I would put it is this, that many of the expenditure schemes were actually inherited. In some ways, the rural housing program existed, NREGA existed, Food Security Act had been just passed in 2013, just a year before the Prime Minister came to office, which was in 2014. But even before the passage of the Food Security Act, a public distribution system was in existence.
Yes.
It's simply that the law was passed in 2013. So many of the programs existed. What has changed is the delivery. The Prime Minister really built this, digital infrastructure based on Aadhaar, mobile telephony and all, and used that extremely effectively. He also has been largely successful in eliminating any corruption that used to exist. But part of the elimination of the corruption has been because he has insisted. So it is his anti-corruption movement as well, that he has. This has been very clearly from day one. If you remember 2014, first thing he had done was to appoint a task force, on fighting corruption. So this was, from the beginning, this was his agenda. And he has deployed very, very effectively the digital technology. And that has allowed actually him to deliver the benefits practically close to 100%, from the
Without
Rajiv Gandhi
fail.
days.
Yes.
You remember, and when Rajiv Gandhi said that, actually they had conducted a study at that time, and the study had actually shown that about some 20 paise out of a rupee was reaching the actual beneficiaries, or it may not have been 20 paise, it's something close to that, but that was the sort of number. Now we are getting closer to a full rupee actually reaching the people. It will never be full rupee because there is some cost of distribution. You got a whole chain of, but 95% of what is to reach the people is reaching. And I think that has made a huge difference. You could also say that, the nature, there's been some shift in the nature of, I remember when 2013 Food Security Act was coming in, I was the lone kind of opponent sitting there because, and there is another television program on NDTV from that time when the Food Security Act was being voted on. Amartya Sen was there on that program. I was there, and there were 3 or 4 others. And I think Sonia Singh was the one who was, or somebody, or maybe Vishnu was the one who was the anchor. And Vishnu sort of started out telling me that, Professor Panagariya, now that everybody else 5 of my 6 panelists agree on this, won't you agree with this? So I said no, because I was of the view that, we ought to shift to a cash transfer system, precisely because corruption is easier to control, and also there was huge inefficiency in the way the Food Corporation of India was handling all these purchases and sales, right? They have to first procure all the grain. So a lot of corruption comes there. And then you also waste a lot of, all the intermediaries that are in there. And then you start this chain and all, and then the government can never do the distribution as well as the private sector does. So my view was that give the money to the people. It belongs to the people. And they will decide how they spend the money. But at that time, of course, Sonia Gandhi was really in charge. Prime Minister was Dr. Manmohan Singh. But really, Sonia Gandhi's this council that she was heading was the one that's calling shots. And people like Jean Reyes, etc., some of these others, they were dead set on that, no, we have to have the actual public distribution system. There was something ideological about this. But, otherwise, why would he be opposed to replacing that by cash transfers? Because money, once in the hands of the households, they will spend it according to their needs on whatever. If medicine is more important, they'll spend it on medicine. The argument that is made often, the head of the household will actually blow it up on liquor and all is completely nonsensical, because households also are interested in the welfare of their families. And suppose, I don't deny, there will be 5% households where this will happen. But for the 5%, you are going to punish the remaining 95%. What kind of argument is that? Right. You can't punish 95% for the 5%, so you got to work on those 5%, but don't punish the remaining 95% where the decisions will be made in a rational way. Whether I want to spend the money on milk or on more rice, or whether I want to spend money on medicine because that's urgent, or on buying some sort of namkeen on the store. That's all my business. So it really, I still feel that, we should really replace this public distribution system by the cash transfers. But in any case, the point where I started was that Modi government has begun to finally move in that direction, and the 6,000 rupees extra that it introduced as a part of its redistribution scheme has been brought in as cash transfer.
Right.
If it was up to me, I would also convert the Narega expenditure actually into cash transfer. Because you see, what happens here is that when you do it through Narega, you're giving money to the panchayat or some entity which is local administration.
Hmm.
But that also there can be corruption there. And moreover, the money is given for some public asset building.
Hmm.
But we have been not doing it for the last 15 years. How many public assets can we build actually within a small little village?
Right.
At the village level, there are not that many public assets to be built.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you're basically wasting that labor, right? I mean, you hire the labor, but is the labor really being actually used to convert that labor into some sort of public asset? I'm sort of doubtful that that's happening on a persistent basis for the last 2006 was the original program introduced.
Hmm.
So we are practically will be completing 20 years of this program, and
Right.
certainly so I mean, how much more public assets have remain to be built in the rural areas? I mean, that's my question.
There can be more productive deployment of this labor.
Yeah, that labor force, if you gave that money cash directly to the household, right? Then
Right.
the household still keeps that labor. Household then goes on the market and then sells that labor on the market.
Right.
And so there is an additional income as a result,
Hmm.
which right now is supposedly being converted into some sort of public asset. But what public asset? I'm sort of very skeptical that is actually happening.
Right. Talking of welfare schemes, Prime Minister Modi has also spoken about first order, second order, third order effects of public welfare schemes. Using any current government schemes, say, I mean, maybe Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or Jan Dhan, to the listeners, could you explain what does the Prime Minister, I mean, from the lens of an economist, what does it mean to have, for a scheme to have first order, second order, and third order effects? And
Okay.
what does that
look,
look like in an Indian context?
to me, particularly the social expenditure schemes,
Hmm.
where I'm really on mostly that this is really the first order effect, which is the most important, because your objective really is to help the poor, and what they use the money for is the real effect that you are seeking. But when we talk of the second, third order effect, what we are saying is this. First of all, what does the Prime Minister mean when he says second order effect and all?
Hmm.
What it simply means is that suppose, I am a poor household and I get 1,000 rupees from the government. I take that and I spend it on something like, whatever I go in, I buy milk, let's say. Then somebody is supplying me that milk.
Hmm.
That money ends up in that household's hand.
Hmm.
And first of all, it creates some extra income for that household, and it creates that employment, whoever is then keeping the cow and giving me the milk, right? So that's the first effect right there. Money in that household's hands will also be spent somewhere.
Hmm.
So then it goes the second order effect and so forth. So that is roughly what, that's the second and the third, the money circulates.
Right.
So those are the effects. But now let's be clear here, one thing, I mean, here, actually what I would say, the second, third order expenditure effect is significantly more important
Hmm.
in infrastructure spending.
Okay.
Because there my primary objective is not social expenditure, but it's to build the infrastructure.
Hmm.
So when I build that infrastructure, I hire workers to build the road, contractors to build the bridge or what have you. Then I, as the government, is spending this money to create those assets, but then in the background, there is a lot of money is recirculating into the system.
Hmm.
Now, we should be very clear that virtually any expenditure you do, any expenditure that the government undertakes, will have these second, third order effects.
Right.
So sometimes you see, I say this because I saw this happening in NITI Aayog when I was there. People, when they come to lobby for their project, they really play up these second order, third order effects and all.
Hmm.
To which my reaction always was that, well, any project I do will have that second, third order effect. And I can immediately give you names of projects or suggest designs of projects which will have larger second or third order effects of what you are saying. So don't tell me what the second, third order effect is. Tell me what is the first order effect. Why your first order effect is better than somebody else's. Because somebody else will also have the second, third order effect. So in assessing the projects, in assessing the projects, this is like trying to pull wool over the eyes by telling, this will create 1,000 jobs will be direct and 5,000 will be indirect. But the fellow where the 5,000 these 5,000 jobs are created, people sitting in those industries are also saying that, I'll create these 5,000 jobs. This is, both sides can't claim, So we have to understand this that, any spending you do has a second or third order effect, unless, people take the money and put it under the mattress if they're not going to ever spend it.
Right.
Then it's different. But usually we don't put money under mattress, we give it to the bank, in which case the bank lends it to somebody else who invests it. So these effects are there always.
You mentioned banks. Two questions on the banks. Almost 10 years ago, if you'd open up a newspaper, you'd be reading about NPAs and poor bank health, banks failing. That was the scenario. How do you think bank health has changed in the last decade? That's one, like for the major banks. And a related question I have is in terms of financial inclusion for the poor, if you could give the listeners a sense of, say, how many more people in this country have access to banks today. So what's your response to both, I would say, the big picture on big banks, but then really for a poor, how has their banking system changed?
Okay. So let's start with the first question. There are often these claims made about this high growth rate during the UPA rule, the 2004 to 2014. With itself, of course, to me, I for a long time argued actually that growth was actually built on the back of the reforms that Narsimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee had already put in place. Because if I look at the list of reforms by the UPA, it's a very thin list. They didn't do very much. But on top of that, what I would say is that, partially that growth was also built on an unbelievable amount of irresponsible lending. You can call it crony lending or whatever, whatever term you want to use. But basically, it was highly irresponsible lending. Telephone calls would go from the North Block to the banks because, our banks are in public sector. So the government owns them.
Right.
And if the North Block says that lend to such and such, the banks follow suit. In the end, the CEOs of the banks are themselves government of India officials. So they are under the Department of, what is it called? The Financial Services, DFS, which is a department within the Finance Ministry. And in the end, it was very clear actually by 2012-13, it was becoming very clear that a lot of these, a very large proportion of these loans are going to go bad. If you look back, I think there was sometime in one of the India Today issues in August 2014, I had written the cover story for that issue. It was on economic reforms and all. I talked about 3 different problems there that the Modi government will need to solve in its very first year. And one of the things I had said that the Prime Minister should preserve the Aadhaar identity program. If I remember correctly, that was one of the 3. Second was that they will need to take care of the banks because these bad loans are ticking. The clock is ticking on these bad loans. Unfortunately, I have to say this, that the Modi government was also slow to react at the time. That Reserve Bank of India governor was even slower. He should have known better. The governments obviously in these matters tend to, unless the problem is at hand, which wasn't there, they don't react. But a banker should. But the Reserve Bank of India also, kept doing. What they were doing in a nutshell, what they were doing was that there was a restructuring program. It was called something like corporate restructuring of loans or something like that, So any borrower who was failing to meet payments would come in and say that, I need to restructure the loan because I have a cash flow problem. It's not a cash flow problem. It was a fundamental problem. The loan was bad. The money was not invested properly. But they'll come in. Now, it's a Sarkari bank. So what are the incentives? The fellow who borrowed, of course, has an incentive to say that I will be able to pay. I'm solvent. But I'm not able to because of the cash flow problems. So let's restructure the loan, in which payments schedule will be changed or interest rate will be lowered or things like that will be done. Banker's incentive also is to say that, banker comes in, he says, I am in this bank for 2 years, 3 years. The Department of Financial Services will transfer me within that period. So as long as the default doesn't happen while I am in charge, I'll restructure.
Right.
So these repeated restructurings were happening. So the loans that should have been actually classified as in default as bad loans were not being classified as bad loans because the banker himself or herself looks good by saying that my loan is not in default. The borrower, of course, is very happy, gets his liability reduced as a result of restructuring. So this game of restructuring was being played. It was very clear. But even the Reserve Bank of India, till the end of 2015 or somewhere in 2015, did not put an end to this restructuring business. It kept floating newer and newer schemes of restructuring. You don't do that.
Right.
At that time, by 2013, look, for me, the problem was first pointed out to me by one of my undergraduate students, actually.
Okay.
I teach a course on Indian economy, and this young student actually wrote a paper on the banks, and that's where I saw, and I said, wow, this is a big problem.
Right.
And one of the first things I did after I came to NITI Aayog was to write a long note about this. But within the government also, there was not enough appreciation of this. And so none of these officers were willing to take the problem head on. By early 2017, the whole credit growth had collapsed in the public sector. Even then, some of the people in the cabinet actually were not willing to accept that there was a serious problem. They said, there is no demand for loans, and that's why the credit growth has collapsed. So I said, well, the private banks are lending. So they said, but they are doing retail lending. So I said, who has stopped the public sector banks from lending in retail? Let them also, why are they not doing the retail lending also? So there's no, but once the Prime Minister then saw it, 2017 early, he saw it that there's a problem. So it was ultimately Prime Minister who took the initiative. Ordinance was brought in to amend the Banking Regulation Act, the BRA, and then Reserve Bank of India. By that time, Urjit Patel had become the governor, and Urjit Patel actually acted very rapidly. As soon as the powers were given to him, 12 largest corporate loans that were in problem, he sent them all to the bankruptcy court. By that time, the code on bankruptcy had kicked in 2016. So basically, the ordinance empowered the Reserve Bank of India to tell these consortium loans to basically go to the bankruptcy court, and he sent all 12. Now all 12 have been cleared. A lot of money has been actually recovered, etc. And then, of course, that Prime Minister had from very early on 2015 promised that there will be no calls made from North Block to any of the banks to do this kind of lending that had been going on before. So that was kept as well. So where do we stand today? I think cleanup has happened. Now, also the corporates who had been cheating the public money in that way have all been deprived of their companies, because in the bankruptcy courts They were not allowed to repurchase those companies. Under the old laws, you wouldn't believe they could come in because the value of the company declines. They will rebuy the same company. So they were deprived of that. They were not allowed to do that by law. So a lot of good things were done, after 2017 by the Modi government, and the cleanup. So on one side, the banks were cleaned up. On the other side, the balance sheets of the corporations also got cleaned up as a result in that process. When we came out of the pandemic, we came in with very strong corporate balance sheets as well as very strong bank balance sheets.
Right.
And so this is why I feel that the future, I think, looks very promising. We are in a good sweet spot in a number of different ways. We can talk about that, but that is the story of the banks now. So therefore, the banks, you can see now the bank valuations of the public sector banks also have gone up in the market. They are listed banks. Banks are listed, so the share values have largely gone up, and the gap in the share values between the private banks and public sector banks has been dramatically narrowed down. So that's the story in the banks. You want to come to the inclusion?
Yes.
I think the big thing, in my opinion, from the financial inclusion point of view for the masses that has happened is really the digital infrastructure. I think that's where the real big story is. Which of course, components of the digital infrastructure themselves are the Aadhaar, the mobile phone, the Jan Dhan accounts. So it has started very early on. That was one of the very first very large-scale project that Prime Minister Modi had done, the Jan Dhan accounts. Right, that was done very early on. I think this probably had started even before I came to NITI Aayog. So it was something that he had announced in his Independence Day speech in 2014, his very first year. And soon after, I think by August or something, he had launched this. And then he had these 2 weeks time or something, where millions of these accounts were opened up, and so that particular instance is recorded in the Guinness Book of Records and whatnot, for opening the most bank accounts within a week or within 2 weeks, something of that sort. So that was done. So obviously that was the beginning. And initially, of course, the skeptics all came in. There are zero balance accounts. So we are also so full of skeptics, you see. So of course now, there are thousands of crores of rupees actually in these Jan Dhan accounts now. They're truly, so there's no question that a lot of financial inclusion happened. But the big change that comes in is coming from the UPI. This is our what is it called, the platform which basically brings all the banks on this single platform. Banks, all of us, the customers, have bank accounts which are Aadhaar linked, so it's very verifiable. And therefore, if you have your account in the Kotak Mahindra Bank and I have my account in State Bank of India or something, doesn't matter. If you transfer money to me, UPI sees your checks in, knows your Aadhaar number. It also knows what my Aadhaar number is and all, and in real time it does the matching and transfers the money in real time. I mean, these transactions in India, actually, even when I sit here in New York, I am able to do much faster than I am able to actually do in my own bank accounts in the United States. If I've got my one account in Bank A and another account in Bank B, it takes a while before I can transfer the money between those two accounts. But in India, it happens in real time. If I want to transfer some money to my brother for some transaction he may have done on my behalf, it's in real time, right away, and people have taken on to it. And because you can do it on the mobile, so today India accounts for something like 40% of the digital payments worldwide. So I mean, really, this has proliferated. I remember this when we launched it. This was soon after the demonetization episode that we had started in the the Bhim app. NITI Aayog,
Yes.
I mean, Bhim app was actually launched by NITI Aayog. It was all, Prime Minister was behind. We weren't doing it, but Prime Minister was really the person driving it all. He's very hands-on. So we used to have very frequent meetings with him on these things and all. And so, then I remember also at the time going to the Reserve Bank of India, Chandrababu Naidu was the chair of our committee at the time, the Digital Payments Committee. And so that was, when we went in, and I remember all the things that we were doing at the time. And that really, frankly, I mean, I didn't anticipate that this will really grow into what it has grown into. Quite amazing, actually, what happened to the digital payment system in India is quite a story.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a model that India has given to the world.
Yes, and it was also, had a long paragraph in our G20 communique very recently.
So you spoke about reforms in the UPA government and whether or not those were substantive. Now, comparing, say, almost the last 2 decades, the time from 2014 to 2023, and which is when Prime Minister Modi government has seen 2 back-to-back terms, and then, of course, there were 2 back-to-back terms for the UPA government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's leadership, who's also an economist by training. How do you compare reforms between these 2 decades, and how would you actually compare the economic management of Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Narendra Modi?
Okay, this is something I've written a lot on. So the overview of this is that there were 2 prime ministers who preceded Dr. Manmohan Singh, who really were very reformist prime ministers. Prime Minister Narsimha Rao, no question, he really changed the direction of the economy completely. So he really sits up there in the pantheon of reforms at the top. And then Prime Minister Vajpayee, it is a kind of sad thing that other than me, probably hardly anybody has realized and elaborated how much actually got done during that government's 6 years. He has not been, even somehow they admirers of Prime Minister Vajpayee have not really articulated the extent of the change that he brought about and the impact of that happened. So in any case, the reforms that happened during the tenures of these 2 prime ministers is really what put India on a growth trajectory that was about close to 8%.
Right.
Now, growth rate-wise, if we go back, 2003-04, last year of Prime Minister Vajpayee, we had already begun to grow at 8%. The growth rate during that year is 7.9%.
The last year of his prime ministership.
Last year of Prime Minister Vajpayee. First year and second year of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was also the same growth rate of about, I think, 7.9% each. So all 3 of these years were, let's say, 8%. Each of these 3 years was actually growth rate of 8%.
Right.
Now, the starting point of evaluating, the management by the UPA. Now, if I look back, what specific reforms did the UPA do in 2004 when it came to office, right? It came to office in 2004. The first budget it presented was for year 4-5. And what reforms it did in the following year. I'm hard-pressed to see any reforms there, except I would say that the Vajpayee government in the interim budget it had presented before it lost the election had reduced the tariff rate from the top tariff rate from 25% to 20%. The UPA retained that, it capped that. In the final budget that came out after the UPA came to office, So they must have presented the budget somewhere in July or so, I would imagine, July of 2004. It kept that tariff reduction. And maybe it was trimming also at that time this small-scale industries reservation list. India has had this tradition of reserving about 800 plus kind of items only for to be produced only exclusively by small enterprises. Very bad policy. And around 97 or so or 96, a reform had been initiated where we started cutting, trimming that list. So it was being every year trimmed a little bit here and there. And so I think UPA probably continued to trim that also. So in the name of reforms, those are the two things I can think of. There is nothing else I can think of. And actually, one of our former chief economists, Shankaracharya at that time, was writing. And he was very disturbed, as I was. So he was the first one to actually write, very early on, it was already probably in May or at the most early June, saying that something, an article titled "Good Man, Bad Policy" something like that. So he said, as far as the team is concerned, it's the first rate. Manmohan Singh, Chidambaram, Montek Alu Walia. What more can you ask for? You got the best team, but the ideas that are being floated. This was he wrote it during the period in which this common minimum program by the UPA was being negotiated between UPA and its other allies, meaning between the Congress and its allies,
right,
within the United Progressive Alliance. Shankar is not somebody who is on one side or the other side. He is very even-handed. If you look at him, he tends to be skeptical. So, where I differ with him is often that I am more on the optimistic side. He is on more skeptical side. But other than that, in analysis, solid, and he's not aligned to anybody. And this was his assessment actually early on. And within a week or 10 days of his writing, I wrote myself actually my first article also, being very critical of what the UPA was doing, was in less than 1.5 months, with less than 6 weeks of the government coming to power. So apparently, the point I'm driving at is that the growth rate had already been kicked up by the reforms that Narsimha Rao and Atal Vajpayee did. And really what these two prime ministers had sown is what the UPA was reaping in its first term.
Okay.
To its credit, I would say that it did not do anything that would have been terribly harmful to the economy. There was no, you can also do, Indira Gandhi, for example, adopted many bad policies, which you'll call the anti-growth policies. And lot of our economic reforms had to do with what the first Prime Minister Nehru had done and what Indira Gandhi had done. And some of the vestiges are still probably there. Now, but to PP's credit, the first term, they didn't do anything that would have harmed growth, and therefore growth continued to happen.
Right.
But then the second term came, and so as a result, they also managed to squeak through a victory in 2009 elections. And then came the UPA 2. And UPA 2, actually, a whole lot of anti-growth things happened. I'll count you a few. But first of all, the budget expenditures went out of hand. The macro, the fiscal deficits really expanded. No surprise, because Pranab Mukherjee, who thought that spending had no effect on, probably that's how he must have thought. He really started going to town with spending. So this massive, the pay commission came in, they implemented the pay commission. And that was before by the way, global financial crisis. A lot of the people tried to hide behind the financial crisis that,
that's the argument that's given, that it was because of the 2008 crisis.
Absolutely disingenuous argument, because the budget for 8-9 had been presented in February, March.
Right.
And pay commission, implementation, etc., had been committed to before the crisis. So it is disingenuous actually when people say, oh, this was a response to the crisis or something. No, expenditures had taken off because Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister. I think in the first term, Chidambaram was the finance minister. In the second term, when it opened up, it was Pranab Mukherjee. And the effect was not from the global financial crisis, but from the new finance minister. So that's the first thing I would point out. Alongside, one can say that all this crony lending really began to expand, and this whole restructuring process of the bad loans acquired a new scale. So that's the second bad thing happened. Third bad thing happened, retrospective taxation happened. There was that new law that Pranab Mukherjee brought in because, he was trying to get the Vodafone to pay a tax that it did not actually owe to the government of India. And so he first fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court and lost.
Right.
When he lost in the Supreme Court, then he introduced a new law, which was the retrospective taxation.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was such a draconian law. And some collateral damage was that a lot of the other companies also got enmeshed into that tax. So that completely destroyed the credibility of India as an investment destination.
Right.
So foreign investors completely kind of, said, so you really, and we were criticized left and right actually internationally for doing that. But I think 2012, the finance minister had changed. Now comes in Mr. Chidambaram. Why did Mr. Chidambaram not change that law? When in 2014, Mr. Chidambaram actually went in a debate with then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, he chastised Mr. Jaitley for not actually repealing the law. Now, to my mind, I think I expected Mr. Jaitley to repeal the law, but to his credit, at least he did enough to put a complete stop to starting any new investigations, that no new investigations will be started. At least he took a major step towards ensuring the future foreign investors into India, that this law will not be used. But, it's rich of, Mr. Chidambaram to kind of chastise Arun Jaitley for not doing something that he himself did not do as finance minister. So in any case, so retrospective taxation. Then we come to the Land Acquisition Act of 2013. So now there was a problem on land acquisition law. This was the law that we had was from the colonial times. And obviously it was a very easy law because the British government wanted to have free hand in acquiring anybody's land for nothing. And so a lot of abuse of that law had been happening, particularly in the states. So quite correctly, prior to that, there had been the case of Mamata Banerjee. Remember, she agitated about the land for a Tata project that had been acquired at a very low price and all. And I remember actually at that time, when I wanted to write a column, I said, I thought I'll write, what is Mamata Banerjee doing? She'll just scare away all the investors. But the more I investigated in the course of writing that column, I realized that actually she was the one who was right and the government had been wrong. So I ended up coming out actually in the column that I subsequently wrote, I actually came out on the side of Mamata Banerjee that she was actually right. So there was a problem. But then the new law that came out went completely in the opposite direction. It made land acquisition incredibly costly and incredibly difficult. So now, in the last 9 years, the Modi government has been hamstrung completely by that law. When you talk to the people who are acquiring, the infrastructure, it's a marvel that, we are able to, the Modi government is successfully building these roads and all.
Infrastructure projects.
But even in these linear projects where land should be a very small part of the cost. Because it's a linear project, you are just, per square mile, you're acquiring very little land, the width of the land that you're acquiring is not dramatic.
Mm.
But today, I mean, this is from as a Secretary of Roads. So the information is from the horse's mouth practically. That 3/4 of the cost of these linear road projects is land acquisition,
Mm. Right.
and
Substantial.
the process has become so much more difficult. Also, what this has done is that because now anywhere where the government builds a project, selling land is so lucrative. It also brings in all the mafia. Land mafias come in, and they, before anybody else, they
Acquire. Yes.
they acquire, or whatever you want to call it. Acquire is probably too mild a term. They basically,
Grab. Land grab.
grab that land. They grab that land. So, it has given rise to all sorts of problems. So, this was also a very anti-growth measure, in my opinion. And that's why I'd written about this. So, that may have been actually my third thing in the August 2014 India Today article the cover story that I wrote. That this act will need to be amended. Modi government did try it in 2015, but it didn't have the votes in the Rajya Sabha. So it failed. And after that, it has not touched it. It's very difficult. Anything that is actually, that once fails, it's very difficult to go back to it. So anyway, so that was the Land Acquisition Act. Story is not over, actually. I would say, I already told you, Food Security Act also to me was not a good act. Transfers were desirable very much, but the vehicle for the transfer through the food distribution, physical food distribution, I think was not my choice. I would have gone for cash transfers. Again, once you put it in place, all the social programs, once you put them in place, impossible to withdraw.
Right.
You can gradually introduce something else which will supplant it, but no politicians worth
In a democracy, yes.
It is going to withdraw it. It will not withdraw. I saw that happening, that even when you knew that a new program is being introduced, which will completely overshadow the old one, and people will exit the old one and come to the new one. We would not announce the withdrawal of the old one for the simple reason that, even though you're replacing it by a much better program, all the media will talk about is the one that you withdrew. Nobody will talk about the one the superior program, which will ultimately supplant the old one anyway.
Right.
But so the dynamics of social expenditures is that once put in place, they are impossible to withdraw.
Right.
Only the one thing that Prime Minister very successfully kind of navigated was the subsidy on the LPG cylinders. But there he politically played it very, very carefully. He said, please give it up. Remember the give it up campaign that he ran.
Right.
So when actually and then the deficits that Mr. Pranab Mukherjee had actually expended in the budget, in the end came to haunt us, because the inflation rate hit almost double digit in 12-13 and 13-14. And our current account imbalance also skyrocketed for at least a couple of years.
Right.
In reaction of which, Mr. Chidambaram introduced a tax on tariff. A tariff on gold imports. Now, you don't try to, when you have a balance of payments problem, your appropriate instrument is the exchange rate. But instead of using the exchange rate, he introduced a high custom duty on gold imports, which remains in place till today. It probably went up during the Modi government. It is a sad thing, because what you do by putting even a small tariff on gold is bring in all these smugglers.
Right.
Now my own Jaipur, I come from Jaipur, and the airport at Jaipur, always these reports coming in of people trying to smuggle gold out of Dubai, because the only international flights that come to Jaipur is from Dubai, and you see these, you hear constant stories. But anyway, so I think, and then another last very important area of anti-growth policies was that in the last 2 years, nearly all projects, 90% perhaps, as much as 90%, particularly the infrastructural projects, got stuck on environmental clearances
Yes.
issue. And I remember that even, in 2014, when this change was being expected, people were all saying that, the new government can't do a thing because, the officer, the entire decision-making process is frozen. No officer wants to make a decision because of this corruption, all these corruption cases that were brought against, perfectly fine officers. They got charged unnecessarily, and in the end they got acquitted. But it is a lot of mental anguish, during the period during which your acquittal has not happened. And people from the beginning were saying about some of these officers that their integrity is beyond question, but they got so the whole bureaucratic decision-making process was completely jammed.
Right.
So the legacy, people forget. You see, the whole thing is that people forget the legacy that the Prime Minister received was I mean, now you think, go back to compare what Prime Minister Vajpayee handed over to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Really, Sonia Gandhi. I mean, frankly, I should say, particularly in UPA too, all the policies were being done by the National Advisory Council, which was headed by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. Prime Minister was practically, powerless in this whole process. So in some sense, he was an innocent victim of the rule, basically, that he's a fine economist, and we all swear by him. We all read what he has written and so forth, and very sensible economics. I've been writing on the Nehru era, my latest book, and have read. These are. In terms of writing, Manmohan Singh has written one book, actually, that was his Ph.D. thesis in Oxford. And that's a fantastic piece of work. There's nothing comparable on that subject after that book. So he's clearly, his understanding is fantastic. And he was the man also navigating the reforms under Prime Minister Narsimha. But I think, basically the show was being run by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi during this period. And unfortunately, rather than from, getting inspiration from Rajiv Gandhi, who I thought was actually a very fine Prime Minister, if he had prevailed. He was not a great politician, and so therefore he couldn't, he failed to do what he actually wanted to do. This is all documented in my forthcoming book, on the Nehru era, because I then also try to take out the implications of what socialism did during those founding years of India. So this is discussed there. But Rajiv was the first modern Prime Minister and first reformist Prime Minister we had, truly speaking. But it seems, Sonia Gandhi really was getting inspiration more from Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the mother-in-law, rather than Rajiv Gandhi. So she clearly had receded back to a considerable degree into the socialist set of policies. So I personally think that UPA 2 was a fairly damaging period for future growth. Because the momentum was there, even during UPA 2, decent growth took place, except in the last 2 years of its rule, or last 3 years of its rule. Last 3 years, probably the growth did fall to something close to 6% or even less, a little less than 6%. Something, it did fall last 3 years. But still, it was decent. But in the end, what the Modi government had to deal with was something very different. So there's a lot of, initially, of course, the Modi government also started slowly. Now I come to the Modi era. Initially, Modi government also started a little slowly. I mentioned, bank cleanup should have started then. My view, the governor at that time, Raghuram Rajan, should have been the one more vigilant, but he was not. But finance ministry was also, partly responsible. It was slow. Initially, also the reforms kind of really didn't start. My own hope was that once the prime minister comes in, because from his speeches, I had hoped that we'll begin to have these reforms right away. But of course, he might not. Retrospective analysis is that I think he knew that he is going to be here for a while now, and he wants to do it right. So he probably started slow. Also, I suspect that there was that episode of Sut Boot Ki Sarkar Jive, and Rahul Gandhi had made that remark, and that really stuck to in the media, the Sut Boot Ki Sarkar, that you are only for the rich and not for the poor, and that sort of really led the prime minister was to really first, I think he did the right thing. And retrospectively, at the time, I was a little worried about it, but he did the right thing, because if you are going to bring in bigger reforms, you better solidify your voters. So he said that no, I stand for the poor, I stand for the farmers. And during that period, if you look at his speeches, basically it's all about talking about poor and talking about the farmers. And he did very little to ruffle the feathers at the time. But then it started 2016. We had the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The IBC came in place. Big reforms. I'd been writing for 20 years, or at least for 15 years for that reform, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So that happened. It was a very big reform. Then Goods and Services Tax was done. That was another very big reform. The urban, what is it called? The RERA, right? To really clean up the housing industry. The RERA was another very significant reform that took place during that period. So good things happened. The Prime Minister had also, I think, launched earlier on for almost a year or two. He carried on that campaign for ease of doing business. So he really focused also in the early years on this ease of doing business a good bit. So then, of course, during this period also, November 2016, you had the demonetization. Now, that's a subject on its own. We can come back to talk about this. People say all sorts of things about it, actually, most of which I disagree with. But that's a subject on its own, so we can, someday talk about it. But this continued then, in the second term, more reforms actually were done. Our corporate profit tax was brought down to 25%. The MSME definitions were changed, to accommodate growth of smaller firms as well. And a lot of foreign investment liberalization happened. Labor laws, very important law. They have been enacted. Very sadly, and I must say that they have not been yet notified. And that I feel is one of the problems, because when I talked about manufacturing is not doing very well. Well, labor laws are quite critical for manufacturing, and those labor laws need to be implemented, but they have not been implemented. They have been passed by both the houses, and also in that sense, the laws have been enacted, but that needs to be done. Some bit of privatization. Air India got privatized. People said that it will never happen, but it did happen. Some few more privatizations have happened. Yeah. So reforms have come back. There is no doubt. The language, political language has also changed. Prime Minister says, I'm doing reforms by conviction, not by compulsion, which is a good thing. For the economists. We like to hear it that the Prime Minister is a bold Prime Minister in this respect. Not, for a while, Narsimha Rao would never announce, which rightly so, because the politics was such that, I used to say in the 1980s also some bit of reforms were done. We used to say these are reforms by stealth, that, you just quietly do it without any fanfare or without any announcements and all. But now I think, the reforms are out in the open, language has changed. Now, there are a few things which I think have gone a bit slowly, and particularly privatization should have happened much faster. I started, in NITI Aayog, this is my proactive initiative when I was there, that we had sought the permission from the Prime Minister that we should really proceed with this, and the Prime Minister gave us the permission. So we actually then did the analysis of individual enterprises and drew up a list of which one should be privatized, which one should be closed down, and which one should be sold off, which ones should be restructured. All those lists we submitted cabinet actually, by before the end of 2016, cabinet had actually given the approval to a to the entire list that we had submitted for privatization, but the DIPA, Department of Investment and Public Asset Management in the Finance Ministry, the secretaries in there for one after the other were simply not interested. They didn't do it. Yeah. So this hold of socialism, starting from the 50s still remains, particularly on the bureaucracy, it's still pretty strong. Currently, there has been a good secretary in DIPAM, Mr. Tuhin Kanta Pandey. So he's the one who privatized Air India, and also there was a steel plant, Neelanchal steel plant, which was privatized, big one, with very high potential. But still, there's a long list of these things. Banks also need to be privatized, and the government had announced, I think, 19 or 20 somewhere there, that two public sector banks will be privatized, but it hasn't happened. The government has announced a proper policy for public enterprises. Finance Ministry announced a policy under which it said, that there are some sectors which are strategic, in which up to 3 PSUs will be allowed, but the rest will be privatized, and all PSUs in the non-strategic sectors will be all privatized, etc. So a policy has been adopted, but it has not been acted on. So there's a long list of things to do list, and one hopes that this will happen in the next of the government in 2024. But clearly, if you are comparing the two records, my discussion, not to make it pretty obvious, that the Modi government actually comes well ahead in terms of any scores that you want to assign. I don't assign any scores like that, but there's no question, that. The basic thing to me is that, what did the UPA receive when it came to power? What did it inherit from the outgoing government, and what did it bequeath? And it inherited a very healthy economy that had been growing at 8%. It bequeathed something which was not very healthy growth, which was and policies that were characterized by several additional anti-growth measures, which the future government had to deal with. Retrospective taxation, by the way, retrospective taxation was in the end repealed completely by Modi government.
Right.
Later on, it has now been completely repealed. So that is also part of the reform process, I should have mentioned. So I think, the question, the scorecard is, and whenever this government hands over the economy to another government, whatever day, if it is handed over by Prime Minister Modi himself, I still think that he will hand over a similarly healthy economy to his successor that Vajpayee did. But that's into the future, we have to still wait and see. I still expect, obviously, Prime Minister Modi to come back and be there for a while.
Right. I think with that, we will wrap up this podcast. And before we go, my final question is, if you were writing a book on Modinomics, what would be the top 5 chapters, names of the chapters that might figure in a book like this?
Well, that's a book still to be written. And, from my experience, I know that you never end up where you start. So, and right now, in this case, I don't even know where I would start. But the one thing I tell you that the theme, I think, I can't say what 5 topics and all, but the theme, I think, will be that this Prime Minister is a very believes in very, very multidimensional development. I think he's not, one reform or 2 reform or 5 reform. It's not like that, at all. He really is very multidimensional. What I mean by that is, geographically, for example, he would look, where we have left which geographies have been left behind in the last, when he came, 65 years or 70 years, 65 roughly. Northeast was the geography which had been left behind. And he really focused on the Northeast. And you can see the change that has happened in the Northeast in the last 9 years. It's just dramatic. So he really, he's also very technology driven. You know, I mean, even I don't have the kind of understanding of technology or even the ability to use technology the way he does. And for a prime minister to have that, that kind of technology orientation is very impressive. And the way, so the whole digitization, etc., that he is doing.
Right.
I mean, growth, obviously, he wants whatever is required for growth, he'll do. So that is an ongoing theme for any economist writing, that part, growth and regular reforms, etc. But he's much more than, growth and regular reforms that we economists would think about. I mean, look at all the, laws that have been sitting on our books since the British era. More than 100-year-old laws. I mean, the 3 laws that relate to the criminal procedure law and all the crime, these laws, which Amit Shah recently kind of announced, whose reforms Amit Shah, and these have been sitting there. Goodness, what were we doing? They should have been, I mean, laws which refer to institutions, they are British institutions.
Right.
What do the British institutions have to do with Indian laws post-independence, So, think so. That's a lot of the repeal of the laws that have never been used. I mean, several thousand laws have been, repealed by the Modi government, So there is another dimension to it. And his development is very human-centric. I think he really, this whole idea of ease of living, right? Ease of doing business, everybody talked about. But he got to worry about the ease of living. How do I make it easier for people, even if incomes are not rising as rapidly as you would like them to? What are the other ways I can ease of, right? The whole Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, right? I mean, we all complained about the problem of Swachhata in India. We never did anything about it, but he really turned it into a movement. And this whole approach of having a deadline that by such and such date I will do it. I think that is, so his approach is also very different. He believes, I remember this, I heard even from 2015, he'll talk in terms of saturation. Let's saturate. Meaning that, so I remember one of the very first meetings, he was meeting with the chief ministers of the northeastern states, including Sikkim. So he's telling the Sikkim chief minister, कि अरे भाई आपका तो आप इतने से 100 विलेज या इतने हाउस होल्ड्स बचे हैं, खत्म कर दीजिए इनको, पूरा 100% कर दीजिए, सैचुरेट कर दीजिए. तो कि हाँ सर मैं कर दूंगा. So his approach is very different. So Swachh Bharat, I want to take it to 100%.
Right.
Piped water, I will take it to 100%. Right. Electricity, I will take it to 100%. Now, 100% may not always mean 100%. It never happens. If some people don't want electricity, so you can't give them electricity. It will not happen. But, as long as like toilets, for example, from 38%, if you take it to, let's say, 80%, that's a bloody fantastic progress. So by making a commitment by a deadline, even if, you missed the 100% figure by, let's say, 10 percentage points, that's a hell of an achievement.
Yeah.
So I think in this respect, a very, very different kind of prime minister. So this is a complicated book to write, which nevertheless, one day I hope to do. I do hope to write one. But I mean, hopefully I live long enough to do it. But yeah, I think, but that's the rough kind of, my sense of what Prime Minister Modi is all about on the economic side.
No, thank you so much. I think anybody, as I'm listening to your answers, and I'm sure as the listeners tune into this podcast, I think you've given a very, very comprehensive, detailed overview of the state of the Indian economy, starting with Narsimha Rao, Prime Minister Vajpayee, to the two UPA government, to the 2 terms of UPA government, and then, of course, to the last 9 years of Modi government and Modinomics. I think for anybody who wants to understand Indian economy, this is really the right capsule and the right crash course to take on Indian economics. And that's really great. And I think that explains why you're teaching as a professor at Columbia and across the world. And yes, that shows how evidence-informed policy is something that you're contributing towards, the likes of you are contributing towards across the world. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today from New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This brings us to the end of this power-packed episode that discussed India's growth story since 1991 all the way up to 2023. For those of us who are interested in short form of content, do subscribe, press the bell icon, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram for shorter reels on the highlights from this episode. As for the next episode, we travel all the way to Bangalore, away from the worries of economics into the world of music. So stay tuned to check out who's our next guest. Till then, take care and stay safe.